The chandelier light sliced across Claire Whitmore's face as laughter rippled behind her. "She looks outdated next to Sophie," someone whispered, just loud enough, and Daniel didn't stop them, didn't even look at her, his hand resting proudly on the young mistress's waist, and for a second the room shrank into something sharp and suffocating. But Claire didn't flinch, didn't speak, she just watched, memorizing every smile, every glance, every judgment, because what they didn't know, what no one in that glittering room could possibly imagine, was that in less than 30 days, every single person there would be standing when she walked in again, not as his past, but as the future they would beg to be part of. Outdated. The word landed softly, almost politely, yet it cut cleaner than any insult Claire Whitmore had ever heard. And the worst part was not the whisper itself, but the quiet agreement that followed, a ripple of nods, of knowing smiles, of glances that slid past her as if she were already fading from relevance. And across the ballroom, under a canopy of crystal chandeliers dripping warm gold light, Sophie Lane laughed, young and luminous in a scarlet silk dress that clung like confidence itself, her hand resting lightly on Daniel Hayes's arm as though she had always belonged there, as though Claire had never existed at all, and Daniel, impeccably tailored, effortlessly composed, did nothing to correct the narrative unfolding around them, his silence louder than any accusation, louder than the soft clink of champagne glasses or the low hum of curated conversations about investments and summer homes in the Hamptons. And Claire stood there in a midnight blue gown, understated, precise, the kind of elegance that didn't beg for attention but commanded it quietly. Though tonight no one seemed interested in quiet things. Tonight they wanted spectacle, youth, something that shimmered a little louder, and she could feel their comparisons like invisible hands arranging her beside Sophie, measuring, judging, concluding. Outdated. The word echoed again in a different voice now, softer, almost sympathetic, as if pity made it kinder, and for a fleeting second her chest tightened, not with heartbreak, not even with anger, but with recognition, because she had heard this before, in subtler ways, in boardrooms Daniel thought she didn't understand, in conversations where her presence had been reduced to background, supportive, safe, predictable, and she remembered how she had once mistaken that for stability, for love, for partnership, but tonight under the weight of 100 watching eyes, she saw it clearly for what it had always been, limitation dressed as comfort, and Sophie leaned closer to Daniel, whispering something that made him smile, a real smile, the kind Claire used to believe belonged to her, and the room responded, laughter blooming like approval, sealing the story they had all decided to tell, that Claire Whitmore was the past, and Sophie Lane was the future, and still, Claire did not move, she did not interrupt, did not defend herself, did not offer a single word to reclaim the space that was quietly being taken from her. Instead she lifted her glass just slightly, the cool stem steady between her fingers, her posture unshaken, her gaze calm as it swept across the room, memorizing not just faces but expressions, alliances, the subtle hierarchy of power disguised as social ease, because what they didn't understand, what none of them could possibly see beneath the surface of her stillness, was that this moment was not her ending. It was a revelation, a recalibration, a quiet line drawn between who she had been and who she was about to become. And as the music swelled and Sophie's laughter rang brighter, Claire Whitmore simply stood there, composed, observant, letting them believe every word they had just spoken about her. Because sometimes the most powerful move wasn't to correct the story, it was to let them finish it, right before you rewrote it completely. The music shifted into something slower, smoother, as if the room itself was exhaling. But Claire Whitmore felt none of it, not the rhythm, not the warmth, only the quiet clarity settling in her chest like something long overdue. And as conversations resumed around her, drifting back to market forecasts and vacation homes measured in square feet and ocean views, she turned slightly, just enough to step out of the center of their judgment without making it look like retreat, because retreat implied loss, and she had not lost anything tonight. She had simply seen the truth in full light, and that was a different kind of power, one she had been denied for years without even realizing it. Because there had been a time when she would have adjusted herself in moments like this, softened her voice, brightened her smile, tried to meet expectations that were never clearly spoken but always felt, Expectations shaped by Daniel's world, by the quiet rules of being presentable but not intimidating, supportive but not ambitious, visible but never the center, and she remembered how easily she had folded into that version of herself, how natural it had seemed to become the calm behind his chaos, the structure behind his risk, the one who read contracts at midnight while he chased bigger deals in glass offices, overlooking Manhattan, the one who noticed patterns before anyone else did but never claimed them as her own, because back then she believed that partnership meant standing slightly behind, and now, standing here under 1,000 lights reflecting off polished marble floors, she realized how convenient that belief had been for him, how neatly it had kept her contained, and across the room Daniel was already moving on, greeting investors, introducing Sophie with a confidence that bordered on performance, as if he needed the room to accept her in order to validate his own choices, and Sophie smiled effortlessly, her laughter timed just right, her presence bright and undeniable, everything Claire had once been told she was not. And yet Claire did not feel small watching them, not anymore. Instead she noticed details others would miss, the slight tension in Daniel's jaw when conversations turned toward quarterly projections, the way his gaze flickered just a second too long when someone mentioned acquisition rumors circulating quietly through the industry, whispers about a firm preparing to make a strategic move, a move that would shift the balance of power in ways most people in this room were not prepared for. And Claire knew those whispers were not speculation, they were already in motion, already structured, already closer to completion than anyone here would guess. Because while they had been busy comparing her to someone newer, louder, easier to display, she had been somewhere else entirely, in rooms without chandeliers, in meetings where voices did not need to be raised to be heard, working through numbers, projections, negotiations that required precision instead of performance, and she could still feel the weight of those conversations, the steady rhythm of decisions made not for appearance but for impact. And for the first time that night a small shift touched her expression, not quite a smile, but something quieter, something steadier, because she understood. Now that nothing about her had ever been outdated, it had simply been unannounced, and as she set her untouched glass of champagne on a passing tray and reached for her coat, the fabric cool and structured against her fingers, she did not look back at Daniel, did not give him the satisfaction of a final glance, because the version of her that needed acknowledgement had already disappeared long before tonight, replaced by someone who no longer required permission to exist in the spaces she chose to enter. And as she stepped out into the crisp night air, the city stretching wide and alive around her, she inhaled deeply, the cold grounding, the silence honest, and somewhere far above the skyline, in offices still lit long after midnight, decisions were being finalized that would soon bring her back into rooms like this one, not as a comparison, not as a memory, but as the answer to a question they had not even realized they were asking yet. 30 days later the air felt different, sharper, charged with something no one in the room could yet name. And the same ballroom that had once reduced Claire Whitmore to a passing comparison now stood brighter, louder, filled with the kind of anticipation reserved for deals that could shift entire industries. And Daniel Hayes stood near the center again, confident in posture but restless in detail, his fingers adjusting the cuff of his tailored suit just a second too often, his attention splitting between conversations and the quiet tension threading through the crowd, because the rumors were no longer whispers. They were expectations, and tonight was supposed to confirm them. And Sophie Lane was beside him, radiant as ever, her voice light, her smile practiced, though even she could sense something had changed, something that did not revolve around her. And as the lights dimmed slightly and a low chime echoed through the room, conversations softened into a collective pause. The kind that precedes an announcement people will later claim they felt coming, and the host stepped forward, voice smooth, deliberate, introducing the final segment of the evening, a strategic partnership, a major acquisition, words that sounded familiar until the room realized they did not know the ending yet, and Daniel's expression sharpened, his focus narrowing, because this was the moment he had been preparing for, the moment he believed would confirm his position, elevate his company, solidify everything he had built. And then the host continued, just one more sentence, just one more name, and everything shifted, because the lead investor would be introduced personally, a rare move, a deliberate one, and the doors at the far end of the ballroom opened not dramatically, but with quiet precision, and for a fraction of a second no one moved, no one spoke. Because recognition does not arrive loudly, it arrives like silence, and Claire Whitmore stepped inside, not rushed, not hesitant, but exact in her pace, her presence unfolding rather than announcing itself, her gown a deeper shade tonight, structured, intentional, the kind of elegance that did not compete for attention because it defined it, and the room adjusted around her without meaning to, conversations pausing mid-sentence, eyes recalibrating, because she did not look like a memory. She did not look like the past they had dismissed. She looked like something else entirely, something they had not accounted for. And Daniel's breath caught not visibly but enough. Enough for the certainty in his posture to fracture. Enough for the calculation behind his gaze to falter, because he understood before anyone said it. Understood in the way numbers sometimes reveal outcomes before they are spoken. And when the host finally spoke her name, not as a guest, not as a former anything, but as the principal investor behind the acquisition that would redefine his company, the room did not react with shock. It reacted with stillness, the kind that follows a realization too large to process immediately. And Claire did not look at Daniel right away. She acknowledged the host, the room, the moment, and only then, briefly, her eyes met his, not with anger, not with triumph, but with clarity, the kind that does not ask for recognition because it no longer needs it. And in that quiet exchange, everything unspoken settled between them. Every assumption, every dismissal, every word that had once tried to define her. And without raising her voice, without changing her expression, Claire Whitmore stepped fully into the space that had once rejected her, not to reclaim it, but to redefine it entirely, because the story they had told about her was never wrong. It was simply incomplete. And now, standing at the center of a future they could not enter without her, she let them finally understand what they had missed all along. The silence did not break all at once. It unraveled slowly, like a room learning how to breathe again after holding it too long. And Claire Whitmore stood at the center of it, composed, unhurried, allowing the weight of recognition to settle without rushing to fill it, because she understood something now that most people in that ballroom never would. That power did not need to announce itself loudly when it was already undeniable. And the host continued speaking, outlining numbers that made even the most seasoned investors shift their stance. Figures in the high 8 digits, projections stretching across years, a structure so precise it left no room for doubt. And yet it was not the scale of the deal that unsettled the room. It was the fact that none of them had seen her coming. Not like this, not at this level. And Daniel Hayes felt it more than anyone, the quiet collapse of assumptions he had built his confidence on. Because for years he had believed he understood Claire completely, had categorized her into something manageable, something supportive, something that would never exist beyond the boundaries he had set. And now standing just feet away from her, he realized how little he had ever actually known. And Sophie Lane shifted beside him, her smile faltering for the first time that evening, not dramatically, not enough for anyone to call attention to, but enough for the illusion of effortless control to crack, because the room was no longer responding to her in the same way, their attention recalibrating, drawn towards something deeper, something steadier. And Claire did not look at either of them again, not because she was avoiding them, but because they were no longer the center of anything that mattered. And when the host finished, when the final details of the acquisition settled into place like the last piece of a structure no one had realized was being built around them, the applause began, not explosive, not immediate, but growing, gathering weight as people processed what had just happened. And Claire accepted it with a small nod, not a performance, not a reaction, just acknowledgement, because she had not come back for validation. She had come back because this was where she belonged now. And as the room shifted from shock to strategy, conversations were forming around her instead of around Daniel, invitations forming in glances and introductions being recalculated in real time. Daniel took a step forward, just one, as if instinct alone could close the distance that reality had already widened beyond repair. And for a brief moment, he looked like he might speak, like he might try to reclaim something, a conversation, a version of her, a past that no longer existed. But Claire moved first, not away from him, but forward into the next conversation, greeting a senior partner with calm familiarity, her voice even, her presence steady, leaving Daniel standing in a space that no longer recognized him as the most important figure in it. And that was when it became undeniable, not just to him but to everyone watching closely enough to understand, that this was not a return, this was a replacement of power, quiet, precise, irreversible. And Claire Whitmore did not need to say a single word about what had changed, because everything about the room already had. The night did not end when the applause faded. It transformed, shifting from spectacle into something quieter and far more telling. Because now the room no longer asked who Claire Whitmore was. It adjusted around what she represented, and conversations followed her not out of curiosity, but out of necessity, voices lowering, tones sharpening, questions becoming more deliberate, and she moved through it all with the same measured composure, acknowledging introductions, exchanging insights, never overextending, never performing, because she understood that influence was not built in moments of display, but in moments of precision. And across the room Daniel Hayes remained where she had left him, though the space around him had changed, subtly at first, then undeniably. The circle of attention that once formed naturally in his presence now thinner, less certain, people still greeting him, still nodding, but their focus drifting, pulled by the gravitational shift that had occurred without warning, and he could feel it, not as humiliation, not as something dramatic, but as absence, as the quiet realization that the narrative he had relied on no longer held weight. And Sophie Lane stood beside him, her posture still poised, her expression still carefully composed, yet her eyes flickered more often now, scanning the room, recalibrating in real time as the reactions she had grown accustomed to began to redistribute. And for the first time, she was not the brightest presence in the room. She was part of the background of a story that was no longer about her, and Claire, across the ballroom, listened as a senior partner outlined expansion possibilities tied to the acquisition, her responses concise, thoughtful, grounded in details that revealed a depth no one had associated with her before, because they had never thought to look for it. And when she spoke, people listened differently, not politely, not out of habit, but with the kind of attention reserved for someone whose decisions would shape outcomes. And that difference, subtle as it was, carried more impact than any public declaration could. And eventually, inevitably, Daniel moved, closing the distance not with confidence but with intention, as if each step required recalculation. And when he reached her, there was no dramatic pause, no shift in lighting, just two people standing in a space that no longer belonged to their past. And for a moment, he seemed to search for something familiar, a version of her that might still respond the way she once had. But Claire met his gaze with calm recognition, not cold, not warm, simply clear, and whatever he had prepared to say faltered slightly under that clarity, because it left no room for assumption. And when he finally spoke, his voice steady but lower than before, it was not an apology, not quite, and not a challenge either. It was something in between, an acknowledgement that he had not seen her fully, and Claire listened without interruption, without expression shifting, because this was not the moment she had returned for. And when he finished, she gave a small nod, not dismissive, not accepting, just final in its quietness. And then she turned slightly, rejoining the conversation waiting for her, leaving Daniel with the understanding that closure did not always come with resolution. Sometimes it came with distance, with the simple fact that the person you thought you understood had moved beyond the version of themselves you had defined. And as the night continued, as deals were discussed and alliances subtly reformed, Claire Whitmore remained at the center not because she demanded it, but because the room had already decided that she belonged there. And for the first time, there was no comparison left to make, because there was no one else standing on the same level anymore. By the time the final hour of the evening approached, the ballroom had shed its earlier illusion of effortless glamour and revealed something far more real beneath it, a quiet reshuffling of influence, of alliances bending in subtle directions. And Claire Whitmore could feel it in the way conversations now carried weight when they reached her, in the way people paused just slightly longer when she spoke, as if recalibrating not just their understanding of her, but of themselves in relation to her. And she did not rush through any of it, did not overextend her presence, because she understood that restraint was part of what made her undeniable now. and as she stepped momentarily away from the center of the room, toward the tall windows overlooking the city, the glass cool beneath her fingertips, the skyline stretched out in precise geometry, a reflection of the same order she had brought back into her own life. And for a brief second, the noise behind her softened into something distant, almost irrelevant, and she allowed herself that stillness, not as escape, but as confirmation, because everything that had unfolded tonight was not sudden, not accidental. It was the result of choices made in silence, of moments where she had chosen not to react, but to rebuild, not to argue, but to outgrow. And behind her, the hum of the room continued, though now it carried a different tone, one that acknowledged her presence even when she was not directly engaged. And across the floor Daniel Hayes remained in motion, speaking, smiling, maintaining the structure of confidence that had once come naturally, yet the rhythm was off, just slightly, the pauses a fraction too long, the certainty not quite as solid, and Sophie Lane stood beside him still, her composure intact but quieter now, her presence no longer the focal point it had been earlier in the evening. And it was not that she had changed, it was that the scale of the room had shifted around her. And Claire turned back from the window, re-entering the flow of the evening with the same calm precision, greeted by a small group discussing expansion strategies tied to her investment. And as she listened, responding with clarity, with insight that cut through assumptions and replaced them with direction, it became increasingly evident that she was not just part of the conversation, she was guiding it, subtly, without force. And when one of the senior executives asked her a question that implied hesitation about the future of Daniel's company under the new structure, Claire paused, just briefly, her gaze steady, her voice even as she answered in a way that reframed the uncertainty into opportunity, not dismissing the concern but absorbing it, redirecting it. And the effect was immediate, not dramatic, but unmistakable. The kind of shift that happens when someone does not just understand the situation, but sees beyond it. And Daniel, standing within earshot, heard enough to understand the implication, that the future of what he had built was no longer entirely his to define. And for the first time that night, the realization settled fully, not as shock, but as something quieter and more permanent. And Claire did not look at him when it happened, did not seek acknowledgement or reaction, because this was never about proving him wrong. It was about becoming something he had never considered possible. And as the evening began to draw toward its natural conclusion, with guests preparing to leave, conversations tapering into quieter exchanges, Claire Whitmore remained exactly where she had positioned herself, not at the edge, not in comparison, but at the center of a reality she had constructed with patience, with clarity, and with a silence that had spoken louder than anything she could have said. As the final guests began to drift toward the exits and the golden light of the chandeliers softened into something more subdued, the ballroom no longer felt like a stage, but like the aftermath of a quiet turning point. And Claire Whitmore moved through it with the same steady rhythm, acknowledging farewells, exchanging measured words that carried more meaning than their simplicity suggested, because every interaction now was layered with an understanding that had not existed before tonight. And she could feel it in the way people held eye contact just a fraction longer, in the way their tone shifted from casual to considered, as if recalibrating how they spoke to her in real time. And she accepted it without leaning into it, without performing for it, because she had not built this moment for approval. She had built it for alignment. And near the edge of the room Daniel Hayes stood with a small group of executives, their conversation polite but fragmented, their attention divided, in ways that would have been unthinkable just weeks ago. And he could sense it even without looking directly, the subtle redirection of interest, the invisible current pulling influence away from where it had once naturally gathered around him. And it was not loud, not humiliating, but it was unmistakable. And Sophie Lane remained beside him, her posture still poised, her expression still carefully composed. Yet there was a new stillness to her now, a quiet awareness that the dynamic she had stepped into so confidently was no longer stable in the way she had believed. And for the first time she did not speak as often, did not lead the tone of their interactions, as if instinctively adjusting to a shift she could not yet fully define. And Claire, across the room, paused near a table where a small group of senior partners discussed timelines, their voices low, focused, and when they turned to her for confirmation, She responded with clarity that did not seek to impress but to resolve, offering direction that aligned their uncertainty into something structured, something forward-moving, and the effect was immediate, not dramatic but decisive, the kind of influence that reshapes conversations without needing to dominate them. And as she finished, one of the partners nodded with a quiet respect that carried more weight than any compliment could, and in that moment Claire understood something fully, not just intellectually but instinctively, that she was no longer stepping into rooms hoping to be accepted, she was entering them as someone whose presence defined the terms of engagement, and that realization did not swell into pride, it settled into calm, into something grounded and unshakable. And as the evening thinned further, the staff beginning to clear glasses and dim lights in gradual increments, Daniel finally looked across the room again, not searching for her in the way he had earlier, but recognizing her position within it, seeing clearly now that she was not orbiting his world anymore. She had created her own. And the distance between those two realities was not something that could be crossed with a conversation or a moment of reflection. It was structural, built over time, reinforced by choices he had not seen while he was making his own. And Claire did not return his gaze, not out of avoidance, but because she was already engaged in what came next, discussing future meetings, outlining steps that would extend far beyond this single evening. And as she accepted a final handshake and turned toward the exit, the night outside waiting with its cool clarity and open space, she carried none of the weight that had once followed her out of rooms like this. No need to replay conversations, no need to question how she had been seen, because for the first time, there was nothing left to prove, only something to continue. And behind her, the ballroom remained, quieter now, holding the echo of a shift that no one there would be able to forget, even if they could not fully explain it yet.